Hello everybody and welcome to the ISO 2400.org webinar on social value monetization. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Shaun McCarthy, I'm a Director of Action Sustainability, and ISO 2400.org is an initiative that we sponsor and host based on our work on the ISO 2400 standard for sustainable procurement. So do visit our website, there's plenty of resources from all around the world in various different languages that you might find interesting to use in your work and your journey around sustainability and sustainable procurement. We've got 4 excellent speakers for you today, which I'll just introduce one by one as we go through. We're going to speak to you from various different perspectives on social value in supply chains, and specifically how we actually monetize social value, how we understand what social value really is in ways that we can understand. My colleague Carol-Ann Smith is on the call as well. She's monitoring the chat and she's going to be talking to you via email if you want to email her if you've got any questions or any issues. Please do feel free to use the chat function in Zoom to record any questions, any comments that you might have. We'll pick those up as much as we can at the end of the session. If you would like to share contact details with any of the speakers, they're all very happy to follow up with you if you've got specific issues that you would like to follow up with them in a little bit more detail. The session is scheduled for an hour and a half. We won't overrun. If we do finish early, we'll finish early, but we'll ask each of the speakers to give us a perspective on the issues, and then we'll invite questions from the group and I'll facilitate any questions and answers at the end. But as questions occur to you, please do feel free just to type into the chat function, tell us what's in your mind, and tell us what you would like to know from the speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Annie from France, who will introduce herself and what she does, and then give us a perspective from France around these issues. Annie, thank you. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Shaun, for giving me the opportunity to talk to this nice webinars. So I'm Annie Sorel, and I founded ASEA, which is a consulting company specialized on sustainable procurement since 12 years. And as I was an international expert and contributor of ISO 24000 standards on sustainable procurement, I want to introduce the subject of today on social value monetization by the definition of sustainable procurement. So the definition of sustainable procurement in the standard is procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts possible over the entire life cycle. So you see the social, it already starts the definition. A few core subjects of sustainable procurement related to social values issues are human rights, labor practice, community involvement and development. And among the sustainable procurement drivers, I chose life cycle assessment of environmental and social impacts. And we developed also in the standard a method for analyzing the cost during the lifetime of the goods or services. This method, called life cycle costing, can be used to analyze the cost for every good and service. And as you know, how does this method works? Everybody knows, you see the price at the bottom left schema, and you see TCO, total cost of ownership. So it's something you are used to, that buyers or procurement people are used to utilize. And what we introduce in the standard is that we could also monetize positive or negative externalities for the organization. For instance, here you see on this part, it's, for instance, the evaluation of costs associated with risks and benefits for opportunities. And above, you see that's all the organization. And on the right side, it's for society. We also introduce the ideas of cost of environmental externalities and cost of social externalities, like job creation or job losses, should be a concern for procurement people. So now, how does it work and how can we use it for social values? So I want to give you 2 examples first for the organization. So what are the opportunities, for instance, of creating social value for an organization? First example, in France, there is a law to promote the integration of people with disabilities either by employing them or by purchasing from the structures that employ them. And if a company doesn't reach a rate of 6% of people with disabilities, they are fined. So procurement people have incentive to buy to structures who employ persons with disabilities, and they create social values because disabilities people get money and are proud to work. And also procurement people who make them work get different regards on disabilities. And concerning the costs, they lower or they cancel the fine. So finally, they lower the cost for the organization. That's what we want to. So it's a direct cost, lower cost for organization. Another example, I could say, is professional investors. They are becoming increasingly involved in the supply chain as a result of the ESG controversies that have arisen from these chains. For instance, the collapse of the Rana Plaza building, and especially on human issues. So the French regulator has issued a law on the duty of vigilance in 2017. And now it means it has paved the way for the collective ESG risk management. ESG means environmental, social, and government risk management. And actually, there is a reflection on the creation of a transnational Article 173. I like to speak about Europe for today, which should contribute to this process. And for professional investors, ESG supply chain issues are part of their own social responsibility, which is in the field of investment is called responsible investment. So responsible investment is the integration of this ESG information. ESG risk management is driven by the desire to minimize negative social impacts or to control reputational and financial risk. And it has led investors to include this information in the risk management. So what I want to say on this subject is that sustainable procurement is completely related to asset management issues. And it's a profound cultural change that leads the company to minimize the risk of negative social impacts, as I told you, human rights, labor practice, and community involvement and development. And good ESG management impacts appeals to investors. In the stock markets, who were battered by the crisis, companies with good ESG ratings have more easily found capital or kept their stakeholders. So by these two examples, I want to tell how we monetize social values for the organization. And now we can see above this line for the externalities for the society, but how can we monetize? First, I want to speak about the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, or maybe the COVID-20 crisis and the COVID-21 crisis. So it was a full-scale CSR stress test. With the pandemic, the company's commitment to social responsibility, CSR, they are being put to the test. And at the operational level, it is clear that companies who have paid close attention to social issues, in particular with a solid dialogue with stakeholders, as they were able to act more quickly and in a coordinated manner with their employees. Their first responsibility, for instance, ensures the protection of employees. So you know that also in your companies. And the companies who have done the best in this area, they are better in the markets, and they should maintain the trust of their employees over the long term. Then the question of the social utility of the company, that is how it mobilizes its means of production and innovation in the service of society, is also a proof of the commitment. Some companies have produced hydroalcoholic gel, others mass-produced masks and equipment to their health patient base. And the best practice, even if some see it as a risk of COVID washing, I mean, the difference will be made with the ability to rethink the business model on this utility line once the peak of the crisis has passed, probably, hopefully soon. And other criterion observed, the sharing of value. And to ensure a balance between overworked employees or forced to shut down with lost wages, some companies have cut dividends or reduced the salaries of managers. So what I want to say is that social utility is now essential for consumers, employees, politicians, and investors. And even sometimes there was the question of making conditional measures for the public procurement. They give some money from one point and they ask this condition on the second hand. And I want to share that the principles of social economy, or we say also social and solidarity economy, it exists in France and also in other countries, and they are identified. And the main objective of this social economy is to have a social, societal, and environmental impact for the general interest. And generally, it includes cooperatives, mutual societies, non-profit associations, foundations, and social enterprise. And their activity is driven by values of solidarity, the primacy of people over capitals, and democratic and participative governance. And you know, they generate millions of jobs. And also we know that social enterprise are also the engine for social innovation. And as a consequence to the cultural change, we have a new law in France called Loi Pacte. And in English, it's Action Plan for Business Growth and Transformation. This Loi Pacte was a result of dialogue and co-construction with a lot of stakeholders. And it's a new step in France's economic transformation. For instance, it's aimed to have companies which are better funded, more innovative, and fairer. Companies, they don't want to make only profit, and they want to do more. And the pact with this law will modify the civil code in order to assert the social and environmental role and provide them with a true, in French, raison d'être. Maybe in English you say purpose. And companies should be places for creation and sharing of values, and employees' work will be better rewarded. So you have probably heard already about benefit corporation and B Corp certification. Huh? So now we have in France, due to this law and this raison d'être or purpose, a big movement of companies, and we call them entreprises à mission. I don't know, in English, maybe we say mission companies. So they give them the mission to have the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts due to their activities. And what I tell you before, it's clear that rethinking the role companies play in the society and increasing social utility is really now more and more essential for consumers, employees, politicians, and investors. And now for the last thing I want to say, for the buyers, procurement people, we also say they are motivated by inclusive challenges or inclusive purchasing. And now they have a list of, for instance, purchasing as a lever for the employment of vulnerable group, as I told you, person with disabilities or person who are far from employment, and we call, there are some integration or insertion structures. In French, we say structure d'insertion. Or we also look of people who work in priority areas of the city. You know, it's difficult to find jobs. So that's a way of inclusive purchasing. Another idea of inclusive purchasing for the development of employment in the territories. So we look about what they buy about with SMEs or with startups. So there are a lot of categories about inclusive. I don't know if you have the same in other countries, but that's the thing they can valorize procurement people. And I want to finish on a last example. You know, we are going to have the Olympic Games in Paris, hopefully, in 2024. And the Paris Games organizers have announced a totally new approach. Now, between now and 2024, small and medium-sized businesses and the solidarity and social and solidarity economy, as I told you, and job seekers and those starting work will have received support to help them take advantage of the economic and professional benefits of the Olympic Games in Paris. And we call them sustainable, inclusive, and solidarity or united games. So I think it's a very good example of how we can monetize social values by these times.
Thank you very much, Annie. There's some really powerful points in there, and interested to understand that, you know, that there's a lot of legislation in France that's taking you in this direction that maybe isn't quite so prevalent in other countries. So hopefully people have learned a lot from that. Usually I save questions to the end, but there is a specific question in the chat from Jaya. I would be very interested in understanding where this data is sourced and on what frequency, and how it is analyzed into the relation of evaluation of value and impact. In the UK, local government bodies are required to publish all spends over £500 at least quarterly. Is there a similar thing in France, in particular under an open data license? So it's a specific question on public procurement, and are there transparency requirements? Are public procurers required to publish their expenditure?
I'm not an expert of public procurement,
Okay.
but I know they publish their national plan for sustainable, and they don't say, I mean, in France we say achat durable, not sustainable, but anyway. And they are making at the moment they are starting a new plan for the next 5 years. And they try also to measure how many, criteria, CSR criteria they put. But I don't have the right answer now. I just want to say, maybe to focus on this question, that there is a lot of companies, consulting companies, about impacts. And that's their job also to try to give examples and to share the results for
case studies and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Also, I wanted just to say one thing about the method I introduced you. You've heard about life cycle assessment on environmental. Probably a lot of people know about it. And we were supported by the United Nations. We have developed a method about a social life cycle assessment. And even if I have no, there are a lot of people developing this assessment. In France, we call it the territory's footprint. There are a lot of methods I can, but a lot of people are working on it. I don't know if I answered properly, but.
Thank you, Annie. And I guess, some of the other speakers I know are going to be talking about the various different monetization models specifically used in the UK. So thank you very much for that, Annie. That was really useful. Please do stay on, and there's doubtless be some questions at the end. So next up is Jeremy Nicholls. So Jeremy, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and very interested to hear your perspective on the issues.
Morning, everybody. So my name's Jeremy Nicholls. I'm the director and some time ago now founder of Social Value International, which is strangely an international membership organisation for people interested in these questions. We have members in about 40 countries and established national networks in around 25, I think, at the moment. We support a principle-based approach to these questions, and one of those principles is to value what matters, and valuation is always quantitative and often monetized. So we are firm believers in this question. And I want to kind of set out a bit of why, really, rather than any of the technical issues. A couple of the other things that I've been involved in, is, as Shaun mentioned, is recently the British Standards Institution has released BS 8950, which is the guidance on enhancing social value. And I think the important thing here is enhancing. I think, and I speak personally, I'm kind of done with measurement unless it has a purpose. And the purpose is here very much around enhancing. And I think that the need for valuation is embedded within this question of wanting to enhance. Alongside that, in the UK, there's been updates to the procurement side around the Social Value Act, and provided some support to that in discussions and contributions. And one of the bits that I'm really pleased to see in that is the requirement to have a weighting for the criteria that are being set around social value within a contract. And although weighting is not of itself monetization, it is definitely a step in the right direction. And we can return perhaps to the technical issues around that. And I'm also involved at the moment in a couple of ISO proposals to develop new standards following out from ISO 37000, which is the governance piece, and very much interested in looking at then how governance does actually show that it is enhancing and what we mean by that. And so the backdrop behind all of this is a concern about accountability, a concern that when Annie was talking about externalities, actually we're talking about things that organizations are not held to account for. And the reality is that the people whose lives are affected by many of these sustainability impacts, many of these consequences, have little or no power to hold the organizations creating them to account. And the ramifications of that are really fundamental. And in part, I suspect, as we look around the world today, in some sense of shock and horror at the many challenges we're facing, so many of those, I think, are consequence related to this lack of management of externalities and lack of accountability. And so we're kind of driven, I think, by what would the world look like if we really were all held to account for these consequences of our actions. And nobody loves that, nobody likes to be held to account. It will be uncomfortable, and consequently there are endless reasons why people don't want to do that. Not because we're bad, because it's a kind of human thing to try and avoid that. But if we were held to account for the consequences of our actions and for the social and environmental things that happen as a result by the people who experience them, then I suspect that those people would want a lot more positive impact tomorrow morning than they're getting. They want it now, and they would want it soon. And organizations would have no choice but to get on with it. And all these, we'll do it later, it's expensive, it's a bit harder, blah, blah, blahs, are all excuses that are a consequence of not being accountable. And so accountability would be, to Annie's point, the most positive, to be actually maximizing that. Now, if you are trying to do that, you are always having to make choices between different ways of doing things. You can't stand still. You always have to think about, maybe there is a better way than which we're doing today. And when you look at choices, when you compare one way of doing things with another, there are inevitably going to be trade-offs between different groups of people experiencing different consequences, different impacts, if you want. You cannot avoid those trade-offs. And it is, the argument is that if we're going to rapidly increase the rate at which we make these decisions, and the number at which we make these decisions, where we really are considering the social and environmental impacts, then we're going to have to take on board all these different trade-offs that are happening. What happens at the moment, of course, is that people do this all the time. You cannot avoid this. As soon as you are deciding to spend money on one thing, to commission one service over another, to invest in one thing over another, you are inevitably making these trade-offs. There will be different impacts between these different choices, and you are saying, on balance, we think this is the most positive. But what happens at the moment is that that decision is made behind closed doors. It is not transparent, and the people experiencing those impacts do not really inform that. And so every time we hear somebody saying, well, valuation is very difficult, isn't it? Here are all these problems. What we're saying is, it's much better if you leave it to me to make those non-transparent trade-offs, because I know best. And that is the big concern I have whenever we have some of these debates, because it is unavoidable that we make these trade-offs. And making those trade-offs transparent and making them informed by the people who actually experience those different impacts leads you to valuation. Valuation is a process to show the relative importance of those different consequences and to make that more transparent than it is at the moment, which is what would happen if we were actually managing those externalities and seeking to make decisions to maximize the impact. I just want to give a couple of examples of organizations doing this at the moment. One I'm going to pick because it's a French company, because Annie kicked off with this. So this is Kering. Now, I'm kind of tempted to share a slide, but I won't at the moment. We can always get back to it. Kering is the company that owns Puma, Bottega Veneta, Gucci, so high-end brands. And they produce an annual report of their environmental impact. And they only look at the negative impact because they don't believe that the positive will be so credible. And I think that in itself is an important point. And they value that impact. They value it, and I think the last year's figures were something like 400 million euros negative. And the first year they did this, the amount of negative impact that they had valued in euros accounted for about 80% of the company's profit. And yet they still went public with that analysis. And to the supply chain question, they go down to the fourth tier of their supply chain. And the bulk of the negative impact is in the third and fourth tier in the supply chain. Now, it was possible to critique this and to argue that it isn't good enough and to say you should have done blah, blah, blah. But we have a company which is becoming public annually with a statement of the negative value that it is creating. And I think that is simply awesome. The other example I'll give you is the UNDP, who are in the throes at the moment of launching a number of SDG impact standards, which will require assurance, which I'll come back to. And in these standards, this question of, are you making decisions? Are you making these choices between different options? And how are you managing the trade-off between those is absolutely central to what we're going to be meaning and looking at as those standards become rolled out. I think that's really exciting. I think the conclusion I have on all this, I'm going to keep this very short, we can come back to it, is anybody who argues against valuation is basically someone who is arguing against being held to account. And I'll leave it with that thought.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. Again, a lot of very powerful messages in there about transparency and accountability. And yes, let's get back and explore some of those themes a little bit in the chat and how we might actually move things forward in that respect. So we'll go over to Louise now. Louise, I know you've had a lot of experience in implementing some of this stuff and faced some of the difficulties and challenges and ambiguities that there might exist around developing, implementing and monetizing social values. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us your perspective, please.
Thanks, Shaun. Well, I will just say it's amazing to see so many women on a Zoom call like this. I work in the construction industry and typically I'm the minority. So it's really, really encouraging and great to see so many women showing an interest. So as I said, I work in the construction industry. I work for a company called Morgan Sindall, which operates wholly in the UK, which puts a slightly different slant on the perspective of social value and has allowed us to focus on the UK market rather than worrying about more global trends. So I am head of social value and sustainability for Morgan Sindall, and we started off on our social value monetization journey about 12 years ago with a tool called LM3, which stands for Local Multiplier 3. And that measures 3 rounds of spend and the impact that those 3 rounds of spend have within a certain radius of the project. And ultimately, you get a ratio for every pound that you spend, you're creating so much economic growth within a certain area. And then we bought a license to that tool in about 2010. And then a couple of years later, a piece of legislation came out of Parliament called the Social Value Act, which you may or may not be familiar with. And that Act of Parliament, it was asking procurers and commissioners to consider the social, economic and environmental well-being of the impacts of what they were procuring. So it was the beginning of what has become a massively growing trend over the last 10 years. And that kind of drove us to different kind of action, really. Morgan Sindall, between 80 and 90% of our turnover is funded by public sector, whether that's central or local government. And so when we started to think about monetization, it was really important for us that if we were going to go on a monetization journey, that the way that we monetized and the things that we put a monetary value to was aligned to the way that government does that. So in the UK, there is a piece of procurement guidance called the Green Book, which sits in HM Treasury. And that is the Bible, really, for procurers and commissioners in the UK on how they should make investment decisions using public sector spend, the things that should be considered when they're making those procurement and investment decisions. So we looked at lots of different monetization tools and methodologies, and none of the tools and methodologies that were available at the time were explicitly aligned to Green Book. And I'll show you an example of the tool that we do now use compared to another tool to show you what the difference is between the results that you get from a different tool, depending on what things you measure, and then secondly, the things that you put a monetary value to. The big difference with the tool that we use now is that it puts a monetary value to the well-being aspects of things rather than just the fairly two-dimensional results of the outputs that you create. So I'll show you that now. So this slide just shows you the graphic on the left with the circle at the bottom is the tool that we use. So this is the tool that is aligned with HM Treasury Green Book. And this is telling us that from a procurement or a construction value of £4.5 million, we're creating just over £2.5 million worth of social value. The identical project on the right, which was put through another tool that measures similar things but uses a different valuation methodology, is demonstrating that it creates £1.3 million worth of social value. So you can see the huge difference that there is in the results that you get just depending on the input to your monetisation methodology. And I would urge you, if you are looking at monetisation options, to just consider who your stakeholders are and what's important to them from a monetisation viewpoint, because whatever you're reporting has to have the same relevance. So for Morgan Sindall, because nearly everybody who we work with from a customer point of view is public sector, it's really important that we're aligning to and building on their business case for investment. I hope that's interesting. I've been watching some of the questions. I think one of the things that's really important for us is because we are a tier 1 contractor, we employ about 7,000 people directly. We have around 500 projects on site at any one time. That involves the engagement directly of our supply chain, which brings that national workforce daily up to between 40 and 50,000 people. So we have indirect responsibility and influence over 40 or 50,000 people every day, and the impact that they can help us to create for communities and our stakeholders, but also for looking after them, you know. And the ISO 2400 guidance helps us think about things like modern slavery and labour rights and all of those kind of things around, you know, just respecting people. And the other thing that it does too, because we've got this massive extended supply chain, is if we are making promises to our customers about the things that we're going to deliver, we can't do that without the support of our supply chain, because they deliver about 80% of everything that we do. So for every £10 million project, around £8 million worth of that stuff goes directly to our supply chain. We're just the go-between. You know, we pass the cash on and we commission on behalf of our customers the services that are required. So if we're saying to our customers we're going to create this many apprentices, it's only right and proper that we share that promise with our supply chain so that they can help us to deliver it. And I think the purpose of ISO 2400, certainly from Morgan Sindall's viewpoint, is that anything that we promise in a procurement should be extended through in our subcontract procurement, because otherwise we will fail. We're either failing or we're lying, one of the two, and we would rather be seen to be doing neither of those, but we would rather fail than be seen to be lying, I suppose, as the least line of resistance. So we have a tool now that we call the Responsible Procurement Framework, which flexes our subcontract procurement requirements to the requirements and the promises and ambitions that we've made to our customers in the principal procurement activity that we've gone through with the customer. And that is one of the biggest tools that we use to help deliver the social value that we create and then monetize. So I think I could probably talk for quite a long time about the stuff that we do, but that maybe gives you a snapshot of the principles that we were absolutely adamant that if we were going to go down a monetisation route, firstly, let's not do it for the sake of doing it, because that doesn't actually add any value to anybody. I think one of the things around monetisation is that it's allowed us to see the double-edged sword of monetisation. You know, carbon at the moment, as far as certainly HM Treasury Green Book is concerned, doesn't attract a huge monetised value, but it's like the absolute thing that the industry has got to respond to, the reduction of carbon. So monetisation shouldn't be seen as a prioritisation tool. It should be seen as a tool that, if it is delivered in the right way and if it's structured in the right way, can become representative of the organisation that you're procuring from, because it looks at the ethics and the morals of that organisation rather than just the deliverables that that organisation promises. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louise. Jeremy, I know you would like to respond to a couple of points in Louise's talk, so maybe if we can ask you to do that, and then we'll ask Alfie to speak, and then there's some really juicy questions coming up in the chat which we can debate as well. Jeremy.
Yeah, I was just in wild support. I just wanted to kind of re-emphasise a couple of the bits really. In the challenges around valuation, there are two bits, but two main ones. First is, what do you value? And the second is, how do you value it? And many of the problems are about inconsistency of what rather than how. And as Louise said, if you get to the well-being of people, and that's what you're really serious about, then that's the first challenge. Many of the things we see people valuing are outputs or they're some kind of outcome, but they're not really about well-being. And that is what you tend to find if you go to your stakeholders. That's what they're interested in. And just to say that the British Standard has very much defined all this in terms of well-being. And so I think the first thing is let's really be thinking about what stakeholders want to see happen, and they'll want to see improvements in their well-being, is my suspicion most of the time. The second bit is as you go down how, there will at the moment be variations because valuation is context specific. And the way to iron this out is some form of assurance, some form of independent assessment of whether you've done it okay, because you can't depend on organisations to obviously do it themselves. As somebody said, I think it was Brenda in the chats, was, there's this tendency to value obviously the positives as highly as you can and the negatives as low as you can. And so we need to offset that in the same way as we do in finance. When organisations produce reports, we get them audited. And if we're going to have reports on their impact, they're going to have any meaning, they should be audited. And this is what the UN is going to be doing. And I think that's why some of what they're doing is so exciting in that. And the issue around carbon being low is just one thing that might be worthy of a discussion, because I think probably it's interesting what the values of those are, because there's a lot of debate around the fact that often the way in which carbon impacts are being valued is too low. Carbon is, in any case, only one aspect of climate change. There's an argument that valuation of carbon effects should be much higher than they are at the moment, in which case I would personally argue that it would contribute, but is not the sole driver of prioritisation, but would be part of it. That was all.
Brilliant, thank you, Jeremy. I think that's a really great segue actually into Alfie, when you talked about auditing and checking that organisations are delivering what they're actually doing. And Alfie, I know you've had some recent experience in that area. So would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about some of your experience more recently?
Yeah, happy to. I could just see Louise did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to go back to Jeremy just quickly and say thank you very much for reminding me for not mentioning it, but actually that was the other part of our criteria when we were looking at monetisation, is that, for every positive there's a negative. So if you're creating this much value here, then there will be this much loss here. Yeah. So, we take account of that opportunity cost. So trying to be as honest as we can be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Alfie, over to you.
Hi everyone, so I'm Alfred Gilbert. I'm a consultant with Action and Sustainability, and I focus on social value and performance management. So I've done a fair amount of work with both public and private sector clients, sort of helping them to better understand what social value is, put strategies in place around social value, sort of understand their goals and what they're trying to achieve. But then the point of today's talk and sort of another aspect of that is then getting down to the actual measurement of it, with specific focus on monetization and looking at how they can implement tools like the Hacked Value Bank, National TOMS, and then also looking at sector-specific stuff. So like the Common Social Impact Framework for rail, these sort of value banks that take changes to well-being, as sort of noted in the BSI standards, and try to give a financial proxy to those changes, which is then essentially taking a change in what could be considered quite a fluffy thing, so changes in confidence, changes in happiness, and putting them almost on a scale that just means they're comparable to other things. So what you can start to do is then bring out or be able to easier identify where your greatest value is being generated across different outcomes of the activities you've been doing. And leading on from this sort of assurance point, and as Shaun noted, I've had experience recently with a sort of a high profile project where we've looked to implement bank values from the Hacked Value Bank. And this was done sort of using processes which included the principles of social value, so sort of involving our stakeholders, trying to understand what's changes, and we did it as robustly as possible. And so we were accounting for both positive and negative impacts. So for example, looking at positive impacts from a construction project to say, if we talk about one stakeholder group in particular, so for employees of that project, looking at changes in job security, whether that went up and down, we accounted for both negative and positive, and then in other stakeholder groups. But what we actually found, which was really interesting, was almost going back to the basic principles of data collection, in that this idea of social value monetization, unless, as Jeremy and Louise have both said, there are proper assurance processes in place, it potentially has the opportunity to drastically be used to show performances in areas which potentially aren't being achieved at all, or to hide both positive and negative values. So on the project in question, from the initial assessment and collection of data we did through the value bank and collection tools and calculators, their overall value came out as a value well into the 7 figures. But then when we went in and actually looked at the data, talked to their supply chain and say, okay, can you show me data that's showing you've done this amount of training? Can you show me data that shows your employees have changed their happiness and confidence in this? None of the evidence behind that was actually able to support the performance that had been reported. And so in turn, we then had to reduce that figure down from what was a 7-figure sum down to a 5-figure sum, which, owing to the nature of the project, if they'd gone out and reported that publicly, it could have been a very negative thing for them in that there were holes in their data and the way they've applied it. But on the inverse of that, I've had some really good experiences of applying these tools. So again, for another construction industry project, they're interested in doing a prospective assessment in trying to understand, okay, what's the potential value? And it was from providing a new playground for a school area. And what they initially had planned was just to build a new playground, as it were, using some waste products from a project. But by doing the social value assessment, what we actually were able to identify through the assessment and using, again, some of those wellbeing valuations, so trying to understand what's changed for different stakeholders, and this in particular was in relation to the school users, so the children and things like that, by being able to identify wellbeing values like changes to outdoor space, we got a lot more inference into what actually can deliver value by delivering a playground. So rather than just delivering a bog standard playground, our assessment found that actually the children most wanted access to green space, and that would deliver the highest value to their change in their well-being. So then we could change the policy to add more green spaces into the playground. There's also identified that giving the school previously there wasn't access for disabled children to space, and actually there's a huge amount of value from being able to get those disabled children into outside spaces for both learning and recreational facilities. So they then designed the playground to be disabled accessible. And in turn, what we're able to do as a project, we're building the same project, it was the same cost, we just slightly changed the design on the data coming from one of these social value assessments to actually maximize the value for those end users. And I think the important point in those two assessments and again, it links back to what Jeremy was saying about the underlying principles of understanding, well, actually, why was the value assessment done and what was the point of doing the assessment? So for the large sector client, they were very interested in understanding, publicly talking about social value they generated, because as a high profile client, they wanted to be able to talk about all the good stuff. However, the smaller project were very, very much focused on understanding how can we generate the most value through this project for our users. And actually, by focusing on that perspective, for them, it worked really well because they were able to achieve those goals over the course of the project. Whereas for the larger one, where monetization was seen almost as an added benefit, it's something to add on to already the good work we're doing on sustainability. Can we capture any social value stuff by not fully embedding it and understanding that social value in essence is an asset, it's something you need to manage, you need to plan around, you need to focus on, rather than just chucking some numbers into a monetization and hoping something good pops out. The processes and rigorous and understanding of social value wasn't as strong there. And I think that's sort of that for me for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfie. There's obviously some themes emerging and some interesting questions coming through the chat. I guess if I can kind of summarize a number of the questions that are coming through, it seems to be a lot from audience members in the UK, but it does apply internationally as well. What model should be used? So that there's a question here about social value TOMs, which people have mentioned in the UK. Louise has mentioned social value bank as another model that's used. Also in Louise's presentation, you saw that actually you can get very different answers from different models. There's also a question about, has there been a piece of work to map UN Sustainable Development Goals against social value TOMs? You know, when people ask me about this, I always say it's a bit like the Wild West out there at the moment in terms of, you know, how you can actually get a handle on measuring and managing these things. And I know that people want a nice, simple tick box way of doing things, but certainly in my experience, and I know in the experience of talking to people on the panel, they'll tell you, no, social value is a very contextual thing. It's not just a tick box solution. But maybe if I can ask each member of the panel in turn about models for measuring social value. Is there a common model? I don't think there is at the moment. There are a lot of proprietary models out there, and one contributor on the chat has said, well, you know, I subscribe to social value TOMs, but it's costing me £15,000 a year, and I'm not quite sure what value I'm getting from that. If I can maybe start with Annie, if you could give us a French perspective, so we're not too UK centric, and then maybe Jeremy, if you can give us a perspective both from UK and maybe more internationally. Annie, in France, is there a common way of measuring and monetizing social value, or is it like the UK where there are lots of different ways of coming up with the answer?
There is no real good tool now to monetize. But I just wanted to react what Louise said about, you said you had a measure on monetary value on well-being. I suppose you said that. Okay, so it just remembers the first time we get a figure about if a company is involved in CSR, what is the return on investment? And so the government made, a consultant made research, and finally they found a figure. I'm not sure of the figure, but companies and CSR are more profitable for 9% or 13%, only for one reason they could measure. It was because of well-being, which was, well-being because there is less turnover of people and everything. So that was the first thing. And we have heard this figure for, 5 years. So we were fed up with that. And because it was the only one, not because we are fed up about it. I agree with the reason. And now what I told you about the tool, we see a lot of companies use a tool called territorial footprint. It's a French company consulting called Utopies. I don't know. And they measure, they may work internationally probably. And they measure, for instance, if you are the French National Rail work. They measure how many people they have worked through the supply chain in France or somewhere. So a lot of companies are proud now to say how they are involved economically in community development. So that's something maybe more mature. And of course, I tell you about Utopies, but we have a lot of other companies who try to have figures about that through accountancy. They try to say, okay, with my tax, where does my tax go? There are a lot of things like that. But to go further to social issues, I would say when you have buying category, you have to look in different studies, surveys you find and everything, and to try to get not a tool, but to have large ideas of if it's a positive impact or negative impact. For instance, if I buy my milk locally, or if I buy this kind of milk, what is the positive issue? If I don't use, for instance, a pesticide on the fields, what is the positive issue, social issues? Not so many illnesses, and we can try. They try to monetize the consequences. But we don't have a nice tool where you have just push a button and say, okay, that's that. So what we wanted to say in the standard, and Shaun knows what we tried to push with the French, is we want buyers or procurement people to open their eyes and to see outside and to see what the consequences of the decisions, either for the organization, but also in the society. And what I wanted to say is that now consumers, a lot of people become aware about that. We have to, anyway.
Thank you, Annie. Jeremy would like to talk about the Wild West.
Yeah, well, he raised it, And I think to some extent this conversation about frameworks and simples is all an example of the lack of accountability that we have, that first point. I think if we were actually held to account, this wouldn't be a problem. It would have been sorted. And in any case, organizations wouldn't have time to worry about whether there was a single answer to all these things. We'd have to be getting on with it. It is indicative of the going down the wrong question, if you ask me. And I think also what happens is that somebody's framework is somebody else's tool, is somebody else's method. It's a bit like comparing a garden shed with the forks that you keep in the shed. And we're not even, the kind of language gets us confused before we start. That said, I think that internationally there is a significant increase in convergence going on at the moment. I think principles that SVR have been supporting for some years, the standards that the UN are now promoting around SDG impact, the work of the impact management project around the structured network of all the big standard setters. Underneath all these things, there is a remarkable amount of consistency in what and how. And obviously there'll be contextual differences happening for different organizations, but the basics are largely there. Nonetheless, you can still get lost in all this, are we getting it right? Is it comparable? Blah, blah, blah. I think the thing to do is to really stop worrying about all that and to go back into your organizations and say, are we actually being transparent in our own decisions about how we are allocating resources and considering these things? Because the truth is, whilst you're right that it might appear to be a Wild West, the alternative, that we do not do this at all, and we do not try and be transparent, and we do not try to get something down, means that we are falling back on our own personal decision-making processes, where we are not transparent, and where the decisions are being made by people with power on behalf of people without power. And it's much, much more like the Wild West, consequently, than what we're trying to do. And all these things and these conversations are actually indicative of the fact that we are struggling to get towards a better sense of consistency. And that will only happen as we have more differences, as we reveal these approaches and we argue about them, will be the things that drive more consistency over time, certainly if it's supported by some level of assurance. Again, the danger here is we use all these as excuses not for doing things. I think one of the big indicators that we've been driving, and I sit on the board of a social enterprise where we use valuation at strategy level and in our operations. One of the things we've started to measure, because we've been over worrying about reporting, is the extent to which we use this in management decision making. And so we now ask all our managers to report on the number of ideas and decisions they've had informed by stakeholder data. And so, because this is for us the real metric, it's the, are we actually responding? Are we making changes? Otherwise, we all worry forever about getting it perfect, produce some lovely report, and haven't actually made a single change in what we do. And as a part of my, getting increasingly grumpy about these things, it's like everybody's a learning organization, but nobody's a changing organization. And yet, businesses are having to make decisions all the time with imperfect data. And they're doing that without worrying about whether they've got the same approach as everybody else in the market before they're doing it. They're doing it with whatever's best for them there to maintain a competitive advantage. A competitive advantage in giving value to their customers. And if we have the same relentless pursuit of creating impact for stakeholders, we'd be much more driven by, are we doing as much as we can to create that impact for? We would be worrying a lot less about some of the more arcane measurement debates that we all get stuck in.
Can I come back on that?
Yes, please do.
I think it's really interesting because there seems to be, I agree completely with everything that Jeremy has just said. And I think the value for me in the Social Value Act and the whole movement around social value, certainly in the UK, that in the 12 years that I've been at Morgan Sindall, I was a one-man band 12 years ago. 5 years ago, I had a small cohort of activists that worked with me in Morgan Sindall. And now Morgan Sindall owns our social value strategy. And I speak regularly to people who say, well, I do that. That's my job now. So for me, the Social Value Act has served a purpose in that it's detracted from what we thought was our core purpose in making money from our shareholders to making people realise actually that there's a bigger impact in the job that you do on a daily basis that you hadn't identified before. And actually by doing something slightly differently or even doing it in the same way, but actually just recognising the impact of what you do has a positive or negative impact on all of the stakeholders that you touch in the job that you do. It's raised consciousness and awareness. And I think, that movement and groundswell of interest and enthusiasm that certainly we've got in Morgan Sindall now, because we've created that, over time, we and the people that influence us, it's just changed mindsets. We are still a construction company, but actually we're a construction company now that believes we improve people's lives largely wherever we go, because we've acknowledged that we're capable of doing that, where before the focus was wholly on, the efficient machine that was Morgan Sindall that churned out buildings and managed supply chain and did all of those core things that we still do, but the nuance is very different now. And that's to me hugely appealing, because there's 8,000 people now at Morgan Sindall who recognise the impact that we have, the potential that we have as an organisation.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Yeah, to Jeremy's point as well about people with power and people without power. There's quite a lot of questions popping up on the chat about ownership and leadership. A comment here from Stacey: I'm yet to see a bid opportunity framework come out that has defined sustainability targets based on the footprint of the opportunity and needs of the populace. They ask retrospective questions, asking us what we do instead of how we will assist. When will public bodies start to take ownership and influence instead of looking to us? That's an interesting question for me about kind of where in the value chain this accountability sits, and how do we kind of affect leadership for that accountability? I guess you could argue, on one side, why should organizations within the supply chain, in this instance of public bodies, wait to be told what to do? And should they be taking responsibility for their own actions, as I think Louise has just articulated? And how much should we be expecting from those at the top, as it were? Jeremy, can I maybe ask you to respond to that first? And I'm sure others will have a view as well.
I think legislation is shifting this way, around, certainly if you look at what's happening in the European Commission at the moment around non-financial reporting, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group to work up and consider what the new form of that directive will be. Now, much to my sadness, we're in the first few days of not being part of the European community as the UK, and as someone who lives in the UK. But nonetheless, I still think that this will drive standards and behaviour elsewhere. This is going to be legislation which I believe will have a much wider scope than it did in the first round, where it probably only affected 500 companies. But we'll increasingly expect businesses to be able to show that this is what, and report on that. It will also, I think, increase the requirement for assurance around that information that people are putting out. And so there'll be a shift towards it. In terms of what's happening around this wider scope of sustainability targets into place, I think the work of the UN is definitely doing that. I think the UN UNCTAD is another UN body which is arguing for this to be very much in terms of planetary thresholds, so that one of the things that gets me, I think, is that we can report on a positive impact, which is more than zero, but it actually makes no significant contribution to achieving the SDGs. In other words, it makes no significant contribution to avoiding the climate disaster and the implications of massively rising wealth inequality. So, just being positive is not good enough. It needs to be positive compared to a target. And I think it's true that we don't have a lot of that being seen at the moment in the Commission frameworks. But in terms of the way in which the impact, community is going, definitely, that is what's happening. And again, I've referenced them again and again, but the UN's DP's work on SDG targets and the UNCTAD's work on sustainability targets, I think, are really good examples of how this is moving. And I think certainly in the UK, the fact that the procurement debate is getting closer to the UNGC's work on this means that we are getting there. I don't think we're being quite grumpy enough. And it's hard, isn't it, when someone comes out and says, look, we're doing something good, to go, yeah, but it's not good enough, is it? And that seems like a great criticism, but unfortunately that is the truth. And again, in financial reporting world, it isn't good enough for a business to go, look, we made a profit, because the investors will just go, yeah, but it wasn't good enough, and sell the shares. So that pressure that we have within financial markets does not exist within impact at the moment. And I would agree that we haven't really got that there yet, to Stacey's question. But I do see some encouraging signs. And despite everything else, I remain a wild optimist. As long as we keep being critical but supportive, we can make these changes, and we can make them into the way which globally society thinks about value and managing value.
Okay, thank you. On the procurement question, in the UK, we now have Procurement Policy Notice 0620, which came into effect from the 1st of January. And I think this was mentioned earlier in terms of a mandatory weighting on social value, and some pretty clear guidance in terms of the definition, certainly of what central government expects its supply chain to deliver. And there's some, evaluation guidance and that sort of thing in there. I guess those participants from the UK, Louise or Alfie, do you have a view on this guidance? That it's very new. Is it clear? Do we think it will be effective? Do we think it will be implemented competently by public procurers? Louise, do you have a view?
Of course.
I thought you might.
I think it's as good as the commissioners that get their hands on it and are allowed to deploy it. You could ask the same question of the Social Value Act. I read somewhere somebody thinks that the Social Value Act's still got no teeth. I have to say, as somebody who responds almost on a daily basis to public sector procurement, I would have to disagree with that. You know, I've had weightings of up to 40% of the overall quality going towards social value, which even 5 years ago it just wouldn't have happened. You know, so I think the Act, when it first came out, was so wishy-washy because it had to be. Its nature, the nature of it wasn't. It had to be, because how do you create a very clearly defined piece of legislation for something that is procuring everything from paper clips through to new hospitals? So, you know, I think it was maybe willfully misinterpreted initially, but I think the work that they've done over the last 3 years in refining and hardening the requirements of just the fact now that it's a requirement rather than a consideration is a huge step forward. And I think the guidelines and the framework that they've created to support the new procurement legislation that's come out, I think will be really helpful. I think the danger is that procurers and commissioners will misuse it. You know, I've had experiences where we're responding to a tender and they say, in this instance, it was the TOMS. So the procurement people in the local authority said, well, here's the TOMS. You decide which ones you want to deliver, and whoever creates the most monetised social value will win. So I think there's huge potential. I think they've created the best framework that they can in the conditions that they've got at the moment. And I think it's down to the expertise and knowledge and ambition and energy of the commissioners and procurers to use the toolkits that have been designed for them, really, to improve the impact of their procurement activity.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Louise. I think this is to Jeremy's point earlier of, something's being done, progress is being made. It might not necessarily be perfect, and we can either embrace it, use it the best way we can, or stand aside and throw rocks at it and be critical. Jeremy, do you have anything to build on what Louise was saying?
No, I agree. I think it's easy to critique, isn't it? And I think they've done I personally think the current version is a very good job given all the troubles around it. I do think it's going to be down to, inevitably, how people do that on the ground. I've also got kind of examples of one tender back to the company I'm a director of, where it was awarded to a competitor who was going to be giving iPads to community reps because that was the highest social value. But that nonetheless is, you don't throw everything away because of these examples. It's these examples which we use to drive improvements. And so I think it's not bad. But the one thing I would raise in this is the role of the oversight bodies within local authorities, which which are supposed to oversee and peer at all the decisions that are being made. It's the kind of internal accountability mechanism. I don't think enough has been done there by them to kind of explore and test and push back at some of the decisions that then are being made around social value. And we have done a little bit of work with them, but I think these are all part of the journey. My concern is it's not fast enough. We've got, 8 years that we're given as targets. We've got 30 international harvests left according to the FAO. There is so little time, and my frustration with this is we can lose sight of that. We just need to do more now, not, and worry less about it, really.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Annie, how are you seeing evaluation in tenders around social value? And are there issues in your experience in France of comparing one tender with another in terms of social value in a fair and transparent way?
I forgot to tell you in my introduction that the first public procurement were at the beginning very innovating about sustainable procurement, because they are the first, we call that the social criteria or social clause. And it was, for instance, for public procurement to give business to companies who hire unemployed people. So instead of giving money to assist people, through your orders, you can make them work. So that was the beginning of exemplarity. And after, now I talk more about private companies with disabilities. And after a while, we were talking these last years about environment problems. And now, since the crisis, we see a much higher concern about social values. So I think, which is good, because poor people, all what we said about with what happened with the lockdown and everything. So I'm sure we are going to, as I told you, to see even public procurement and private procurement. They try to measure which companies inclusive procurement is something I would say would resume territories, local procurement, SMEs, people, as I told you, away from disabled people, or and what can I say, business priority areas of certain cities and everything. So it's began to be structured. I mean, I see a lot of big firms working together so to help this procurement, and also public procurement at the moment, because situation is very dramatic everywhere in France and in Europe and everywhere in the world. I mean, it seems that inclusive procurement is a big concern for everybody. And public procurement want to be, I would say, exemplarity. I don't like this term, but that's the term we use in French. And also they have some money instead of some companies, private companies. So they try to do, I would say, as citizens, we are also much more aware about things, and we want to challenge them.
Okay, thank you, Annie. Alfie, if I can just come back to something that you said earlier, which we worked together, so I'm aware of this, but I just want to come back to it. So you were working on a specific project, and you had a contractor or group of contractors that were claiming a 7-figure social value monetization, and then you did some verification, and that came down to a 5-figure number. So it went from millions to tens of thousands. That's an astonishing change. What was that? Was the contractor lying? Were they just not understanding how to do it, or was it just that they simply couldn't produce the evidence in a way that was acceptable? What was driving that?
It's sort of tricky to know without asking them, and probably to get a direct response from them as to why it came back. But from our assessments, it was simply that the data provided was mainly incorrect or unsubstantiated. So a big one being training. So they'd said over 500 of their staff had been trained over a 1-year period. When you asked for training logs, individuals looking at training, nothing was available. It was just no internal learning systems to then back that up. So in terms of understanding changes to well-being, we couldn't robustly say that this impact had happened on people. We couldn't see that anywhere. And I wonder, sort of on the project, whether because this was a subcontractor reporting their performance back up to a client, they will probably have felt a pressure, potentially from a lack of understanding given by the clients as to why they're collecting data around social value, a pressure to give that big figure, as it were, to show the value they're generating for their client through the project. Whereas actually the point of the valuation the client is doing, while we've talked about the client of doing in this, is again more around strategy and policy adaptation. It's understanding where value is being generated, both positively and negatively, and then understanding through a process of change how they can then maximize that or mitigate the risks. And I'm not sure that there was that link in terms of, sort of Annie touched on a bit about collaboration there between subcontractors and outside businesses as well, and the importance of that, of actually, again, because, and again, this isn't a critique, and there is that sort of this changed understanding of social value means different things to different businesses at the moment, whereas we can all sort of, on this cool bad sounds things, we will understand it's change to a person's well-being or impact from something. But within businesses, that there needs to be that understanding from client through the whole supply chain as to, as Louise is saying, as the work Mortensen will do, is it's involving their supply chain in developing and understanding their social value. Without talking to the supply chain, you won't get the real figures coming out of it.
Just jump so many. I can see Louise jumping at that as well. There's so many things in that. Firstly, I don't care. I want to know what decisions they made with this information or not. That's what I want to know about. And we probably didn't make any, so it's like that is the real question. But this is what will happen, you know, if we are interested in the external reporting of this information without assurance. And even if we did have it, it will happen. There are plenty of examples of companies who've reported audited accounts with profits which turn out to be completely wrong because some error was made in that by factors of millions as well. But we don't, when we see that, go, oh, well, that's it with financial accounting then, let's find somewhere else. We go, look, these are human systems and human beings are frail, you know, they will not work. We have to put things in place to minimize our human tendencies, our biases, all those things to make it effective. that's what societies do. You know, as Alfred says, you come and review it, and you came and checked it. Now, there are international standards for this now. Even the International Accounting and Auditing Standards Board, which is the main financial historical body on this, has got standards out for this kind of information, and has got guidance out now for the assurance of what they call extended external reporting, that specifically covers impact. So that's good. SVI have an assurance standard on these things. The UN are going to be assuring their work. You know, we are starting to recognize that without these controls around this information, we will have this madness and this variability. But I still don't mind, because in the early days of finance, we didn't have any of this either. But the point was that businesses were using this information. And the question we have to keep asking, I think, is, yes, but did you use it? And how did you use it? Because truth is, at the moment, no one's using it at anything like the rate or the amount that needs to happen if we're to avoid the chaos that is, you know, a few years away if we don't get on with it. I think I'm a stuck record on this one now, aren't I? So I'll go away.
Thanks, Jeremy. Louise.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through, you know, my experience at Morgan Sindall of measuring, reporting and monetizing social value outputs. You know, one of the internal benefits for me as head of social value and sustainability is that by ascribing a monetary value to something, people who are trained to count widgets for a living, if they think that there's a value to it, then it changes their view of it. So it's been really helpful with things like diversity and inclusion, you know, and the fact that creating an apprenticeship for somebody who maybe is wheelchair bound has a greater value. And they're all pluses and minuses. It's all negatives, and, you know, there's negatives and positives everywhere. But actually, just the nature of identifying for the people who are responsible for delivering this stuff, it gives them a different focus, and it makes them realise, actually, you know, that there is an impact there that was unidentified, and there is a reason why we have a diversity and inclusion plan. There is a reason why we have an air quality plan. You know, the stuff that we had to do around creating a monetary value for our environmental management plan was really helpful, because to do that, we had to create a baseline, and there is no baseline for carbon. You know, what's the, at the moment, you know, if you're building a £5 million primary school, what's the baseline against which you can improve? So to enable that, we had to create, it's basically a shopping list of options that and it puts them from bronze through to platinum. And if you create platinum, everybody wants to be platinum, nobody wants to be bronze. So it's changed the behaviour of our organisation just because everybody wants to be the best. And by demystifying these really complex subjects that not very many people are trained to understand and manage, you know, like carbon management, like air quality and water usage and stuff like that, it's just enabled this just levels of engagement that, you know, that I never imagined we would get, really. It's fantastic. That's kind of a byproduct of the benefit of the monetisation process for Morgan Sindall. And the other thing, Jeremy, talking about accountability, if you've looked at the green paper, which is out at the moment, sorry, this is turning into a very UK-centric conversation, which might not be as helpful for a lot of the audience, but the green paper on the procurement from government at the moment, there is a sort of accountability built into that going forwards, because you can use previous experience of a supplier to inform your future procurement decisions. You know, that's the proposal, which is fabulous, because it means that we are going to become accountable for what we claim, because otherwise we won't get any more work. You know, where at the moment, or historically, it's been, we can say whatever we like because they won't hold us to it. So that's great.
I think that's such an important point, Louise. I think so much of this conversation around procurement, and this is an international challenge, I've noticed this kind of on the travels everywhere, is that where these things are happening, there's no consequences if you don't deliver it.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can say whatever you want about the social value you're going to create, but then no one tracks whether you did or you didn't. And if they did, they'd find out what Alfred had discovered. But even then, there wouldn't be any, right, here's a penalty clause, or you're not going to get any work next time. And so unless there are consequences, and that's what accountability is, isn't it? There are consequences for your performance, and you know, something will happen, and it won't be good if you don't.
We are, you know, to be fair, actually, Jeremy, we are starting to be subject to commercial penalty if we underdeliver again.
Yeah, it's starting to happen, but it's really good to see it happening, because for so long it's been absent. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap now because we're absolutely out of time. A fascinating discussion, and thanks very much to all our speakers. And I think we're ending on quite an optimistic note. We know there's a lot of confusion out there. We know that this is a work in progress. But listening to what Louise has been saying, Annie, Jeremy, Alfie, there is a momentum in the direction of being held to account around some of these things and to really deliver. Yes, it's imperfect, and yes, we know we can always quote examples of things that don't go quite as well as we would like them to. But this is a subject that isn't going away. We'll doubtless be back again to have further debates on this subject. So thanks to all of our speakers for a really engaging session. Thanks for the audience out there for staying with us. I do hope you found it valuable. Carol Ann will be following up with all of you that are on the call today. Once we have a recording of this session, we can send out to you with a link to YouTube or whatever. Please do feel free to share. Do keep an eye on our website, ISO2400.org, where we've got lots and lots of resources around sustainable procurement and people contributing from all around the world. So thank you very much to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are in the world, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shaun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.